Today, Laura Lippman is joining us. Most of her books are set in her native Baltimore and deal with topics as diverse as politics, foster care, and certainly crime. Her latest novel, Life Sentences, raises troubling questions about memory and truth. Laura Lippman was a newspaper reporter for 12 years, the last 6 as a features writer for the Baltimore Sun. Her Tess Monaghan books, including By a Spider's Thread, The Sugar House, Baltimore Blues, Charm City, Butcher's Hill, No Good Deeds, and In Big Trouble, have won every major mystery prize, including the Edgar, Seamus, Agatha, Anthony, and Nero Wolfe Awards. Additionally, her novel, In a Strange City, was touted as a New York Times notable book. She is the author of 3 previous standalone novels, To the Power of Three, Every Secret Thing, and most recently, What the Dead Know, which became an instant New York Times bestseller and won the Quill Award for Best Mystery, as well as mentions on several roundups of the best books of 2007. Fall 2008 marked Lippman's serialization in the New York Times Magazine, and with The Girl in the Green Raincoat, a continuation of her PI character Tess Monaghan, a recipient of the first Mayor's Prize and the 2003 Maryland Authors Award. She lives in Baltimore, Maryland, with her husband, David Simon. Please join me in welcoming Laura.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thanks for coming out in the middle of the day. I learn as I go, and so last night I did something and it was pointed out to me that I did it in the middle of the presentation, and by then people had too much context, so I should do it at the beginning. And I was really taken. I've known about this for a while, but there is something online called the page 69 test. The page 69 test posits that if you turn to page 69 in any book, you should be able to tell if you want to read it. And I submitted my book for the page 69 test, but also for the page 99 test, which is a Ford idea, axiom apparently, that page 99 will reveal the essential quality of a book. And when you do the page 69 test, what you're asked is, does this page represent your book? And do you think it would make people want to read it? I was very certain that the page was representative, that it was a good sample of what's going on in a fairly complicated, twisty book about memory. But I found myself, and I just felt like I should go with the initial impulse I had when I read it, is I thought, I'm pretty sure that women will want to read this book based on page 69. I honestly don't know what men will think. Unfortunately, there are not that many men here today, but I especially asked them to listen with open ears, but just to be, really to be honest, because you're here, so I feel like, I can already sort of count you as being somewhat sympathetic listeners and readers. And if you really feel like, oh my goodness, I would never want to read that book, then I have the rest of the time to try to persuade you that page 69 is not representative. But I've borrowed a book here, and I'm just going to read page 69, which, by the way, I've enjoyed reading, but now you have no context. I've told you really very little about the book. And actually, for this to work, I have to start with the last 3 lines on page 68, so perhaps the whole test is flawed from the beginning. It was hard trying to come to terms with the fact that her father had such a huge and ruling passion, much larger than any Cassandra had ever known. Sure, she knew what it was like to be swept away in the early part of a love affair, but she was amazed by those people who never seemed to abandon that wildness, that craziness. Would it have been easier if her father's passion had been for her mother, or more difficult? In some ways, she was glad that her father's big love was for someone other than her mother, because she at least had her mother to keep her company. Around her father and her stepmother, Annie, she'd been lonely, the odd girl out. Especially as a teenager, she couldn't help feeling that they spent their time with her wishing she would go away so they could have more sex. Of course, teenagers think the whole world is sex all the time. But even now, as an adult with 2 marriages behind her, Cassandra still believed that her father's sexual passion with Annie had an unusually long lifespan. If Annie left a room for even a moment, her father looked lost. When she returned, the relief that swept over his face was almost painful to see. He was crazy about her. That's the kind of line her father would have redlined in an essay, as vague, imprecise, and overwrought. Yet it was true in his case, and Cassandra didn't have a clue why. Annie was beautiful, yes. The mild flaws of her face, the space between the front teeth, the apple roundness, the heavy brows that she never tended, balancing out the cartoonish perfection of her body. Sweet, too. Not unintelligent, but not sharp. This, more than anything, had bothered Cassandra, then and now. If her father, for all his snobbery, could choose a woman of ordinary intelligence, then what were the implications for his daughter? After an exceedingly awkward adolescence, Cassandra had grown into a reasonably attractive woman, not necessarily pretty, but sexy and appealing. Yet whenever she visited her father, she was reminded that the qualities that he had taught her to value, intelligence, quickness, had nothing to do with the woman he declared the love of his life. The test of a first-rate mind, her father often said, quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald, was to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously without going insane. Cassandra looked at herself, she looked at her stepmother, and she concluded that her father had a first-rate mind. What do you think? Are you intrigued? I mean, no, be honest, because I'm going to tell you about the rest of the book. I mean, I don't have to worry about the page 69 test because now I get some more time to tell you about the book that I wrote. But, what about my impulse that it seems very feminine to me? I don't know. It seems like a book that women instantly would get. You know, it's a girl worried about her father. I have no idea what men would think. And I like to bring men into my world as readers. And so I wondered about that, and I'm still puzzling over it. Some of the writers I know hate the question, where do you get your ideas? And I've never understood that, because I think it is the most reasonable question to ask a writer. I've heard people tell people, don't ask a writer that. And the best I can guess for the writers who don't like it is that maybe it's something mystical they don't want to go into. Maybe they're worried that if they talk about it, they won't be able to do it anymore. Years ago, when I was a young reporter, I wrote about writers quite a bit. And one of the first writers I ever wrote about was Fran Lebowitz. And she's, for those of you who know her, she has this amazing wit, and she's very sharp. And I was a little nervous going to meet her. I thought she would be devastating. I thought she would just be bored. And so I came into the interview and I said, look, I'm going to apologize in advance. I have to ask you lots of questions you've been asked before. And she said, you don't have to apologize for that. There's a certain set of questions which are the appropriate questions to ask me. They're reasonable questions. And you've never asked them before, so why shouldn't you ask them? And that was very freeing. And when I became a writer, I thought, it seems to me not only reasonable, but a pretty good question to say, where did this book come from? Sort of like the eternal, it's like the eternal, where do babies come from? Except it changes from book to book. Sometimes I can stand in front of people and say, this book came to me at this moment. Sometimes it's that clear. That was certainly the case 2 years ago when I published a book called What the Dead Know. I could tell people the date and almost the time, because I know exactly where I was. I was headed to a baseball game, opening day, Washington, D.C. I'm a Baltimore girl, but I have a mixed marriage. I married a guy from the D.C. suburbs. And it was really important to him to go to opening day when baseball returned to Washington after such a long hiatus. And there was a group of us who had all grown up in the area. We're in a car, we're driving to D.C., and we pass a shopping center, a very ordinary shopping center. And we all kind of looked at each other, and the car went quiet, and someone said, do you remember what happened there? And we all did. It was a place where, when we were teenagers, two sisters had gone to the mall, and they never came home. To this day, people don't know what happened to those two girls. And that inspired a book right there. It was like, wow, what would happen if someone showed up and said, I'm one of these two sisters who disappeared? What would, and there it was. Life Sentences has a very different origin story, if you will. And it's like a little bits of string. I was like a bird who just kept gathering things and building and waiting until it took some form. Interestingly, it also begins with a story about baseball and Washington baseball. And it actually goes back to that same month in April 2005 when I had the little lightning bolt moment. It turned out I was having a much more general dawning awareness of something. My husband for years told this absolutely charming story about his devotion to the Washington Senators of his youth. And he loved to tell people the story of how he smuggled a transistor radio into school to listen to opening day, to listen to the game on his radio. And he sneaks down to the bathroom and he's hiding in the bathroom listening to the radio. And he particularly adored Mike Epstein, the only Jewish player on the Washington Senators. Epstein was his favorite. And it's opening day, and the score is tied. It's the bottom of the ninth. Bases loaded, Mike Epstein up at the plate facing Catfish Hunter. And my husband prayed. He prayed to God and he said, "Dear God, if you let Mike Epstein get a hit, I promise I'll be so good about going to Hebrew school. And I won't complain about all the lessons I have to do to be bar mitzvahed. Just please, God, let Mike Epstein get a hit." And Epstein hit a home run, a grand slam, and won the game. So when baseball returned to Washington in 2005, my husband, who's a former journalist, but still commits acts of journalism now and then, thought he should write about this. And he started to research it, and almost none of it is true. I mean, at this point, the only thing we've been able to establish is true is that there was a player named Mike Epstein who played for the Senators. Never hit a home run on opening day, much less a grand slam, much less off of Catfish Hunter. He probably, at some point, a friend of ours who's really sort of took this challenge on, thinks he has found the game. It's not opening day. It's nowhere near as dramatic. I mean, it's pretty easy, actually. Sad to say, it's not. The number of home runs that Mike Epstein hit in his career is a finite number, and it's not one of the larger ones either, as baseball players go. So here's this story told over and over again with no intention. My husband believed every single bit of this story. He was shocked at what his memory had done to this story. And really, it really could not begin to process how had it gone so wrong. I mean, yes, it makes a better story, but he's a journalist. He's pretty much trained in the habit of fact. And he is not someone who ever availed himself of fiction in his journalism. He was really, he's probably, I would say, more judgmental on that topic than anyone I know. And yet his memory had led him so badly astray. To tell this story, it's what I think of almost as a first date story. And we all have them. We have these stories we tell about ourselves. They're like little mini myths. And the point of the story is it describes some essential essence in a charming and self-deprecating way. It's a story we tell when we want people to know us. What happens when the story we tell so that people will know us better turns out to be false? And what if it's a much, much bigger story than Mike Epstein? What happens then? So there's some string. I go home and I'm like a little robin and I put it away, but not enough yet to make a nest. I have a really long-term interest in memory. And if anyone's ever gone to lauralippman.com, there's a little red button. You push it, it takes you to one of the most bare-bone blogs that ever existed called The Memory Project. And this grew out of my experience as a teacher of writing, which I've done off and on. I do it because I love it. As a matter of fact, I have a love for teaching of writing that is almost to my detriment. I often get myself in trouble because I take on teaching gigs that I really shouldn't be trying to shoulder with my current schedule. And one of the things I've tried for years to impress upon students is that they should try, if they're really interested in writing, they should try the discipline of keeping what I call a fact journal. The problem with this, and I don't blame students for not wanting to do it, is that the payoff is just way too delayed because you have to do this for about 10 years before you actually figure out how it works. I mean, I wouldn't do it if someone's, but I discovered it by accident. I've been a fitful keeper of journals, off and on, off and on. And every now and then, you know, on a rainy night, I'd pull a journal off the shelf and just open it at random. And I quickly learned something, which is whether you're 15 or 25 or 35 or 45, if you write in a journal, I'm so blue, I'm so depressed, it doesn't convey anything. It brings with it no memory. As a matter of fact, the rather disconcerting thing about it is that you're like, oh my goodness, I seem to have had no emotional growth between 15 and 45. I'm still working on the same stuff. What's going on here? But if you record an event factually, color, temperature, people's names, what you did, what you wore, what you saw, you don't have to use a single, you don't have to say how you felt. It's in there. It's in there in the tangible details. If you can write concretely and factually, the emotion will come with it, and the memory will come with it. And what I always remember, the greatest illustration for me of this was, I have a bad memory, by the way. Everyone has a bad memory, but I'm really open about it and candid about it, and you know, am constantly apologizing to people because I don't remember names and faces. But when I was a very young reporter, I started off in Waco, Texas. And then people are always like, well, at least were the Branch Davidians there when you were there? I'm like, no, I was pre-Branch Davidian, Waco, Texas. So it was not the most fascinating place in the world, but I was very much the new Yankee in town. And in Waco, Texas, they had a funny little sort of hazing ritual for the new Yankee in town. They sent you, it was like one of these perennial stories, someone was always doing it. There are these guys in central Texas, and Waco sort of sits 100 miles north of Austin, sort of in the middle of this. It's not geographically in the middle, but it's how the state defines itself. And there are these guys in central Texas who really like snakes. And the way they sort of justify their hobby is they turn it into an educational thing where, like, the Lions Club will have like a little fair, and they'll say, have you ever gone camping and worried that there was a snake in your sleeping bag? Well, our guys are going to show you how to get out of a sleeping bag with 20 snakes in it. You know, it's just utterly bizarre, and they love doing it, and this is how they rationalize it. So in March of 1982, bear in mind, you're being told this story by someone who has an awful memory, and it's not that I tell it that often. I went out on a rattlesnake roundup with a man named Butch Heffelfinger. And what's funny is I can never remember the name of his friend. I want to say we called him Shorty for some reason, but I don't know about that. And we caught 17 snakes. And I came home that day, and what I wrote in my journal, it's not all in the journal. What I wrote in the journal is, stood on the front porch here at 509 West 23rd Street, watched the sunset, ate a stoned wheat thin, and it's all there. I know everything. I know how, for some reason, the day that I went out and caught snakes with Butch Heffelfinger, I just was filled with this feeling that something was going to happen. I could have been standing on my front porch singing the song Something's Coming from West Side Story. I was absolutely right. Within the month, I'd fallen in love with someone, and my life had changed a lot. But none of that's in there. It's not, oh, I think something's going to happen, or I'm feeling very restless. It was, I can see the check on the peach and blue shirt I wore that day because I worked with fact. So I had that. So there's some more string. And you know, I just told you I have a really bad memory, and it's true. I have a memory for one thing. My first language, if you will, not really my first, but apparently my preferred, my natural language is the language of narrative. It's most people's language, really. We all tell stories. So I could run into you literally 3 days from now. I'd be like, I could run into Emily, who just, gave me this, and I would be, I know you, and I kind of, but the minute she said, I was the one who broke my toe, it would all come back, because that's a story. And I think and breathe story. It's what I understand. It's what we all do. It goes back to Mike Epstein. We organize our life in stories, and that's where my memory works. So, I don't remember people's names, I don't remember people's faces, but I do remember their stories, and I think we're all influenced by narrative in that way. And so there was some more string. 2 years ago, I published the book that had its lightning bolt moment, and it was a very successful book for me. It's what people call a breakout book, which is great and gratifying. But again, it was inspired by a crime that had been committed in my area, and in my area, everybody knew instantly what the inspiration for the book was. And whenever I did events in the Baltimore, Washington area, people asked me about it. And inevitably, someone said, "Did you get permission from the family to write about their story?" And I tried to be very clear, it's not about the family. I made up a family. I did use the family situation, but by the way, that family situation is not unique. I mean, truly, it's not unique. There have been other sisters that have gone missing. And by the time I made up my family, it had nothing to do with the family that had inspired me, other than the fact that the event took place in the same time frame. And I tried to move it. But at any rate, so people would say, "Did you get permission from the family?" I'd say, there are two answers to that. And one of them is about me as a very nice person, and one of them is about me as a person you're going to think is not so nice. So I'll tell you both. Answer number one is that I'm a former journalist. I know how to find people, and it's not hard to find this family. It's not hard at all. I did not get in touch with them because even though it was my intent, and I believe I fulfilled my intent, to write an incredibly sympathetic book about what I'll call the impossibility of closure. There's sort of the idea that we all move on, but the victims of certain crimes never do, and that sometimes we press them to pretend that they have for our comfort. I said, even though I had the best intentions in the world and felt that I was going to write a sincere and empathetic and non-sensational novel, if I reached out to that family, what was the best result? It would be utterly neutral for them, and it might be painful. That was about me. If I called them, I would be seeking to make myself feel better. I would be looking for their benediction, and they should not be responsible for giving that to me. That's the nice person who didn't call. The not so nice person, I don't need permission to write about anything. I just don't. I don't concede that as a writer. I've been writing for 12 years now. This is my 14th novel, my 15th book. I have written across the boundaries of age, class, race, gender. I will not concede any territory is off limits to me. I just won't. And people did not like that. I mean, some people didn't like it. They felt that they were really disturbed by it. And it's something I'm happy to talk about. And I thought about it a lot. I think a lot about everything people tell me. Yesterday on my way to the airport, someone sent me an email that began, "Are you the ignoramus who in your second book did not know that the word suppose should have a D on it?" I wrote back, "I am sincerely disgusted. I will never read one of your books again." Now, I have a rule. If you write me and carry my website and you sign your name, I write back. And I wrote back and said, I'm pretty sure I was the ignoramus who made that mistake. And I apologize for it. I am sorry for it. It's not an excuse, but when I first started writing, I had a full-time job, and I didn't understand the extent that I really needed to go behind the copy editors and the proofreaders, and and she felt bad. I don't think she should feel bad. I mean, it was a little strongly worded. So I mean, I really do take in feedback, and so I thought about this a lot, and I realized that we actually have extremely mixed messages in our culture about life stories and who owns them, and whether they do have value. I mean, Monica Lewinsky sold her story for a lot of money, and we may have all sorts of judgments about that, but no one said she wasn't no one said she wasn't allowed to do it. And, you know, people understood it's her story. Criminals, felons, are not allowed to profit from their stories in most states. So stories apparently do have value. And so it is a commodity that can be sold. And you can see that people would be troubled if they felt that I took someone else's commodity and made it mine. And I don't feel that way, but I was trying to see it from other people's points of view. And, you know, finally, the final bit of string is that one of the greatest paradoxes of being a writer is that it cuts into your reading. And particularly, it cuts into what you used to read for pleasure. Because now I began writing crime fiction because I loved reading it. And now 9 to 10 months out of the year when I'm really deep in the writing process, I can't read it because I'm scared it's going to get in my head. Or I tend to read a lot of British crime fiction now because I know the voice can't get in my head and I won't imitate. And I read a lot of mainstream fiction. And now if I'm working, there are novels I can't read while I'm working because it's just too close. The subject matters, I want to read it, but I can't. So I read a lot of memoir. I love memoirs. And I think the charm in memoirs for me is that the voices are so particular and the stories are so distinctive that there's no way I'm going to end up being influenced by them. And, you know, at the same time, you know, going back to being a journalist, so I worry a lot about how factual memoirs are. I was reading Truth and Beauty by Ann Patchett. How many people here have read it? It's a gorgeous book. I love it. I love it. It's a book about a friendship between two writers. And her friend was Lucy Greeley, another memoir writer. And Lucy Greeley wrote this amazing book called Autobiography of a Face that was about the disfigurement she had from having cancer as a child, and they kept trying to rebuild her jawbone and do skin grafts. And she was a poet by training. She wrote this gorgeous book. It became a huge success. And Ann Patchett notes that people were always coming up to Lucy Greeley and saying, "How did you remember all of this?" And she would say very pointedly, "I didn't remember it, I wrote it. I'm a writer." And I mean, I love this book, but the implication in that passage is that if you're a good enough writer, you're allowed the license to make things better than they were in memory. And so the corollary would be, but if you're not a very good writer, you're not. I don't know what that means, and I struggle with this, and I'm fascinated by it. Life Sentences is a book about a memoir writer. And when she goes back to write what she hopes will be her 4th book, a book that will put her back sort of in the success column because she's had a little setback, she starts talking to people who were in her memoirs, and they don't like them very much. And it's funny because the people she had long expected to be critical of her memoirs, her father and her mother, they've always been okay with it. You know, her dad, who's particularly exposed in the first book, she even mentions in the book that even her 2 ex-husbands don't have that many complaints. It's always these very minor people who are showing up. Like her former therapist writes her an angry email about how he's depicted in one of her books, even though he's not named. And I wanted to write about how fallible memory is. I wanted to write about what happens when you figure out that one of those stories you've been telling your whole life isn't true. And that is essentially the story of everyone in Life Sentences with one exception. There is only one character in this book who actually has a pretty clear-eyed view of herself. Every other person in this book is living their life according to a central myth that cannot be supported by the facts. And I was already getting ready to write it. I was, you know, about 2 months out from starting this book when that final piece of string I needed showed up. And I was at an event, and I was talking to another novelist, and we began talking about a memoir that we both admired, or I began talking about a memoir I admired, and the novelist, a man, was a little reserved at first. He said, I'm in that book. I was the writer's boyfriend, and I don't think she treated me very well. I come off very badly in the book. Now, I was like, literary gossip, you know, can't wait to get home and open it up and find out. So, I mean, I really did go home, and I pulled the book off the shelf, and I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I finally found him. He's on about 2 pages, and even knowing his point of view and trying to read it, it was the most utterly neutral portrayal I could imagine. And I thought to myself, maybe the most frustrating thing of all is to be a minor character in someone else's memoir. To just be this glancing presence. And as it happened, during these years of string gathering, I'd had coffee with a woman that I'd known from grade school. And we're doing the what happened to this, what happened to who, what happened to who. And I asked her about someone in our grade school class, and she said, oh, you know, it's the weirdest thing. There was a live shot one night, you know, a homicide in West Baltimore, which unfortunately is an almost daily occurrence sometimes in Baltimore. And I think I saw her at the edge of the crowd that had gathered around the reporter. I'm pretty sure I saw her, and I could tell that life had not turned out well for her. And again, I was obsessed with this idea of a glancing view of someone you once knew, and wanting to know their story, and wanting to find out their story. There was in Baltimore, in real life, a woman named Jackie Bouknight. Jackie Bouknight was almost certainly emotionally disturbed. She had a son. She had been investigated for child abuse, but her son was allowed to remain with her under the condition that she would receive regular visits from the Department of Social Services. Something went wrong. The Department of Social Services missed a couple of those visits. The next time they showed up, they said to Jackie Bouknight, where's your son? And Jackie Bouknight invoked her constitutional protection against self-incrimination. I mean, think about it. They have no evidence of a crime. They don't know, they just know he's not there in the house where he's supposed to be. And the one person who knows, Jackie Bouknight, won't talk. Jackie Bouknight was sentenced to jail under a contempt charge. They kept her there 7 years. She never broke. And I didn't cover this story as a reporter. I've never met Jackie Bouknight. Friends of mine wrote about it. And that's where I got my real life inspiration. And this is a book about two modes of being. There's Cassandra Fallows, who tells you everything about herself, sometimes even when you wish she wouldn't. There's Cassandra Fallows, who cannot be silenced, who will not be silenced. Words come out of her in this constant, never-ending gush. And there's her old classmate, Callie Jenkins, who's famous for not talking. And I just wanted to put those two women on a collision course and see what happens. And life sentences is the result. And the one thing I know for sure about this book is that I haven't met anyone yet who claims to have a perfect memory. And at least not after I finish the talk. And it is a book about memory, and I think we all have these stories, perhaps with fewer grave implications than the stories Cassandra has told. And so that is the story of how life sentences came to be. I always like to take questions, and I'll repeat them for the podcast if people have them. And I'm happy to take questions about writing, about Baltimore, about the Tess Monaghan books, if those are the books that drew you here today, and what Tess's future is, because I do know I happen to be the source for all the information about Tess. But anything that people would, I just always find that people's questions lead us into some really interesting places. If you want to challenge me on my right to go to the well of real crime for inspiration, I'm happy to expand on how I feel that's acceptable. Anyone? I'll keep yakking. If you want some, free entertainment. But it's been a really interesting. This book just went on sale Tuesday, and yet I feel I've been living it for so long. And I've found that it's a book. When the thing about going out and talking about a book is, it's not so much about whether reviews are good or bad, although you would prefer that reviews be good. But what you really look for as a writer are people getting it. Do they get this book? And so far, in the almost dozen reviews that have come out, I would say that people are really getting it. And, that's really, that this is a subject. I mean, I don't sit at home with, like a little magical author cookbook and think, what will catch people's attention? I think what interests me. And I have to think there are other, if anyone here wants to be a writer, some of the best advice I've ever heard is when you're trying to write a novel, your goal should be to write the novel that you can't find that you want to read. And that really is what I do. When I first started off, I write series and standalones. This is a standalone. It's a self-contained book. There's some characters that recur among the standalones, but never in a major way. If they've had a major role in one book, you'll never see them in a major role again. And then there's a series, and the main difference between writing a series, and people tend to talk about my work as if, they're the standalones that are serious and almost, I'm quoting other people now, almost transcend the genre, which is not my favorite phrase. I think it's problematic for some. And then there's her Tess Monaghan series, that's just something light and tossed off. The difference is, I think, is that a series, I can't use Tess up. The emotional development of a character in a series has to be so incremental if the series is going to keep going. And, it's what's rather astonishing to me is to do the math and realize I have written 1 million words about Tess Monaghan. It's really, and we're talking 10 books in one novella. I mean, if we start trying to figure out how many words Robert Parker has written about Spencer, it really probably is like closer to 2 million, easily. And the thing about the Tess Monaghan books, though, that the only time anyone ever seemed to get it, they got it in an utterly negative way, but they did get it. I was once reviewed in a British newspaper that described the Tess Monaghan series as chicklet with guns. And yeah, actually, because what the Tess Monaghan series is about the life of a young woman. And it starts with someone who's 29 and out of work and in a crummy relationship. And over the course of these books, she has slowly done all the things that women do in their late 20s and early 30s as you find the right job and you become more settled in your relationship and you get over like the parent stuff. And I've always talked about the metaphor for young women that life sometimes feels like this enormous picnic blanket that you're trying to get to spread on a windy day, and you have to anchor a corner, and you can't get any of the corners down, and like bit by bit, so these books have been about Tess Monaghan getting the corners down, and so they're very gentle in their character development. When I wrote the serial that Emily referred to in her very nice introduction, I actually thought, are there any people here who actually read the Tess books? I mean, I could just, okay. Well, I admit, when I started writing the serial for the New York Times, I thought it was the end of Tess Monaghan. And I was like, go big or go home. Do it in the New York Times. And what I did was, in a very conscious homage to Rear Window and Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, I made Tess Monaghan 7 months pregnant and on bed rest for preeclampsia. And she's going to have a baby at the end of this, and it's all over. And then I got there, and first of all, I could just tell emotionally it wasn't all over. I could just tell I wasn't done. And then I actually began to think about it from an intellectual standpoint, which was, did I really want to write a series of books that suggested that once you had a baby, it was all over? I mean, no, I don't. I mean, the reason I always thought it would be over for Tess when she had a baby was because I couldn't figure out how readers would feel if Tess as a mother put herself in jeopardy. But one of the things I'm really proud about of the Tess Monaghan series is that one of the biggest challenges of writing a continuing character in series fiction, especially if she's a woman, is that the form demands suspense at the end, right? I mean, that's why we read crime novels. Something exciting is supposed to happen at the end. The big challenge for me, and I really think I've met it, is how do you get your character into a suspenseful situation without your character being an idiot? And I mean, I have my friend Lauren Henderson, who's a wonderful British writer. She used to always refer to this as the "what's that strange noise in the night? Let me throw on my filmy negligee and investigate." And I'm really actually very proud of the fact that over the course of the last few Tess Monaghan novels, she's made mistakes. She has made errors in judgment that have led her to be in very suspenseful situations, especially in the serial. But she hasn't been stupid. She has not done incredibly boneheaded things that would have the reader screaming at the book, how could you do that? And I'm really proud of that. So I think Tess will be coming back, but she needs, I keep telling people, she really needs time to sort out this childcare issue. So she won't be back. I've been alternating. She won't be back next year. But I know she's coming back. I just don't know exactly. She's going to need more people working for her. She's going to need a lot of help. It's going to take a village to raise Carla Scout Monaghan. But the thing that's nice about working on a book like Life Sentences is when it's done, it's done. These characters, we're over. I mean, Cassandra Fallows is actually an interesting person to write about because she's a writer, and I've never done that before. And I was, working on this book, and I'd shown some pages to my agent and my editor, and there were a couple of observations. One is that Cassandra is not exactly what you would call likable. I think she's interesting. I think she's charismatic. I think she's very good company. She's not particularly likable. And my agent said, you understand people are going to think this is you because she's a writer from Baltimore. She's about your age. And I was just horrified. Like, how could, and I had all these rationalizations in my head for why people wouldn't. But then I thought, you know what? They probably will think it's me. And I'm okay with that. And this is something I sort of worked out for myself this week while talking about this book, is I've decided that that's the quid pro quo that makes it fair. Yes, I say as a writer, I don't need your permission. I get to write about whatever I want to write about. Okay? And the bargain is you get to think about it whatever you want to think about it. And if you want to think I'm Cassandra Fallows, you know what? I'm okay with that. I am. I mean, I'm utterly okay with it. I mean, I don't agree with it, but, and because I would never presume to tell anyone how to read my books. Because every time, every reader brings a unique experience to the book. One of the things, and I haven't gotten on the whole crime fiction soapbox of, I think the best written crime fiction is on a par with the best literary fiction. Nick Hornby, in writing about Mystic River, I should get this quote exactly right. I should go look it up so I can say it exactly right. Nick Hornby, writing about Mystic River, said, there's a perception that the crime novel is a lesser novel than the literary novel. And he's talking about Mystic River, so I'm very comfortable. I'm not holding my work up as this example. He said, it strikes me that a book like Mystic River does something that's much greater than a literary novel does. It does all the things that a literary novel does, and it has this really he said it's like, it's like they do a little extra dance on top. And I do think the best literary fiction deserves that credit. But, I don't really worry about categorization or how my books are perceived. And part of that is because when I sit down to write, for those of you here who are really diehard mystery fans, I hope there's some, the ones I've met read up to 7 books a week. And What the Dead Know, the book I published 2 years ago, was actually dedicated to 2 of my favorite readers, women I met because they are such maniacal readers. They come to conventions to meet crime writers. And I've known them for years. One's a school teacher in Omaha and one's a retired librarian in Ohio. When I sit down to read, I think of my friends Sally and Doris Ann. I write for smart people. I write for people who in some ways are better read in my genre than I am because they have more time to read because I've stolen all my reading time for writing. And I think, okay, I'm writing a book for Sally and Doris Ann. They've read everything. They know everything. There's not a twist, there's not a thing, there's not a this, there's not a red herring that I can throw at them that they haven't seen. And sometimes, if not Sally, if not Doris Ann, there are going to be people who read my books who figure stuff out earlier than I wish they would. What do I bring to that reader? How do I keep that reader in the text? And that is my ongoing challenge as a writer. I want someone to, someone literally picked up one of my books that actually has a pretty big twist and figured it out on page 3. But they read it to the end. which is all I can ask. They read it to the end because even though they could figure out what was going on, they couldn't figure out why it was going on. And I'm really conscious of that. Every year when I write, I set myself a new task. And this year, working on the novel that I hope to publish next year, I decided like one of the hardest things to do in fiction is to write the story of a happy person. It's really hard in a crime novel. But I've started working on that. So, you know, I'm really proud to be categorized as a crime writer. The only thing that ever grieves me is that I know there are people who would like my books who don't pick them up because they think they don't like crime novels. Are you raising your hand?
I have a question.
Yeah, oh good. I thought you were identifying yourself as someone who didn't like crime.
Well, I am kind of. And I actually lived in Baltimore for a year and a half, and I loved parts of it, but then I really would say the number one reason I left was because I didn't feel safe down there. And I moved up to Boston, and I felt safe ever since. And so, I'm not really a mystery crime reader, so I'm wondering if that's why you like Baltimore partly, because connected in like your love of that.
I think that what happened was Baltimore was my beloved hometown, and I moved back there to work at the newspaper. And then I got there, and there were things that as a child that hadn't registered with me really struck me hard. And when I moved back to Baltimore, homicide was at an all-time high. It was, I mean, I think I've used this line in a novel, homicide oxymoronically is a way of life in Baltimore. I mean, and part of the thing with Baltimore and me is that as much as I love it, I'm determined to write about it in a really clear-eyed way and to confront what I love but also what I don't like. And I'm horrified by the violence in the city. I mean, where did you live? I have to ask. I know it sounds like such a provincial question. Were you in Charles?
Pretty far out. I lived in Towson. So.
Wow. Because you were actually very, very safe in Towson. I mean, one of the bizarre things about Baltimore, and it makes me kind of crazy, is that like if you look at Baltimore is roughly shaped like the city proper is roughly shaped like the state of Nevada, and you know, with the harbor kind of eating down at the little corner. And if you took sort of like a T shape and placed it over that shape, everyone in the T is incredibly safe. The T sort of runs up from South Baltimore through city center and then across the top of the city. And it's almost all of the homicides take place in those little two areas that got left out on the east side and the west side. And what's bizarre is that people who live in the T think the fact that people are getting killed every day in those two areas, that's not their problem. And like, you know, I mean, like, I don't want to get all John Donne on you, but you know, no man is an island, and every man's death diminishes me. And you know, I realize that there's a really big world between where I sit in South Baltimore and the places in West Baltimore where people die, even though but it's only 2 miles away, and it's my city. And so I write about it because I wanted to write about Baltimore, and to not write about crime seemed, I mean, you can write about Baltimore and not write about crime. Ann Tyler writes about Baltimore, but Baltimore is not her main subject. She's not trying to figure, she's a very great novelist who happens to be in Baltimore. And she's not, but yeah, I kind of do feel that, you know, Emily mentioned in the introduction, my husband is David Simon. He was the executive producer of The Wire. And for him, he wrote about crime, but what he was really interested in was decaying institutions. And I was asked recently in an interview for a newspaper in Dublin to sort of explain the difference between our worldviews. And I said, you know, my husband is really fascinated by institutions and how they undermine the value of the individual. But he actually has fairly, you know, sort of optimistic, almost Pollyanna-ish views about human possibility, whereas I love people and I'm fascinated by them, but I actually am a much darker person in some ways. So I guess in short, yes, it is why I write about crime, because I'm from Baltimore, and it just seemed, I mean, here's the thing about crime is that it's such a good vehicle for fiction. The reason, especially murder, when a homicide happens, a society, it's sort of like the lid is ripped off. and a lot of things that are covered up the rest of the time. It's such a distortion in the force, if you will, when someone is killed, that all of a sudden lots of things happen, and it can happen in very traditional crime fiction, but it can happen in less traditional books too. I love Richard Price. I don't think he's a crime novelist. I would like to, and these are these funny distinctions that people make. I think part of it is because Richard, he doesn't come at his stories in I want to tell the story of a crime. If you read Lush Life, this amazing book, he wanted to tell the story of the gentrification of the Lower East Side of New York. And a crime happens, and that allows him to explore what was so interesting to him thematically, but it's sort of the least important thing in his books. I wrestle with how to define Kate Atkinson, whom I adore, and has written this brilliant trilogy of books about a private eye named Jackson Brodie. And you would think that they're crime novels, and they're kind of crime novels. They actually play by all the rules of crime novels, except that her overwhelming interest is in the nature of coincidence in life, which is sort of at odds with most crime novels. And so, again, this is a tricky issue of categorization, and some people just aren't going to like crime novels. They just aren't. I mean, my main thing is I worry about the people who don't know yet what they're saying no to. And in a book like Life Sentences, actually, when my husband and I were talking about it before the reviews started coming in and he's reading the book, he said, you should be fine. You should be fine with reviews. He said the only thing people could really spank you on is that the crime in this book is so secondary, which is true. I mean, in some ways, the crime, this old crime that Cassandra Fallows has come back to Baltimore to investigate, is just one big fat MacGuffin. And yes, you will find out the answers. And I will tell you that deep in the book, when Cassandra knows everything that happened, look, if you get there, if you read it, and I hope some of you will, there is a passage in the book that is one of the most meta things I've ever written in my life, which is about the nature of questions. And this came from my life as a reader of crime fiction, which is, again, going back to that smart reader. One of the things I figured out about my readers is they'll do most of the heavy lifting for me because they're smart and they've got big imaginations, and they're just going through like, what about this, what about that, what about this, what about that, what about this, and they're working so hard that I can just sort of like slide it right past them, because it's just like, sometimes I can tell them, there's like one book I wrote where I basically told people in the first chapter what happened and no one believed me. They're like, and they come to the end, it was so surprising. I was like, I told you in the first chapter. How did but my dad was like, oh, I was so sure it was this other thing. I'm very proud to be a crime novelist, but at the same time, I would love to bring people into the tent who don't understand how good some crime fiction is, because the best crime fiction today is so very, very good. And, it just has, I read a lot of literary fiction, a lot, and I get perturbed sometimes reading literary fiction at the disdain for storytelling, at the sloppiness of it, at the things they avail themselves of in the final acts. I mean, it's probably my main complaint about literary fiction is this fear that a good story is too tidy and too commercial to be art. Yes, ma'am.
Just going back to the subject of the memory of things, and I'm just wondering, if you have siblings, you probably realize that you have these totally different views about something that happened when you were all growing up in the same house at the same time.
Absolutely.
So, but I guess my question is it, do you draw a line between is it memory, or is it that you just experienced it at the time in very different ways?
Well, what about when they differ factually? What if when someone has a factual memory and one of you has to be right and one of you has to be wrong? My sister says we went to see the French Connection together. I said we didn't. That's not an issue of perception. That's an issue of it happened or it didn't happen. I mean, a lot of it is, of course, where you stand. And actually, that's a very good question, because I always go back to the old theatrical joke that was used in the film Shakespeare in Love. And the cast of Romeo and Juliet has gone to the pub at the end of the day, and the actor, because of course it's all actors because it's in Elizabethan times, who's playing the nurse is sitting at the bar having his ale, and someone says, what's this play Romeo and Juliet about? And he goes, oh, it's about this nurse. I mean, that's the story of everybody. It's about me. I mean, if you think about how you tell a story, you always tell it from where you stand, from what you saw, from what your perspective is. It happens that as a novelist, I spend most of my working hours putting myself behind different people's eyes. And that's my job. I mean, that's really my job one is empathy. How do I see the world from someone else's? I've gotten to the point where actually I'm becoming not as good a storyteller because now I'm becoming really obsessed with telling all the context that I leave out. I had this great story about a boyfriend who broke up with me by announcing he was moving to Guatemala, and it was the night that I'd run a 10K race, and I also had dental surgery, and I hadn't had any solid food for a week, and I hated chicken fried steak, and it's a really funny story. It was like my little first date story. But lately, I've really started to think about it from his point of view, and I can't tell the story anymore. Because actually, I think he was justified. I think, you know what? I think he really saved us both when he moved to Guatemala. That was a good thing to do. And so there's perspective. You see the story from where you stand, and that's where you have different perceptions. But then there are people who, have these stories that they've been telling for years, and they find out it's somehow got faults. I don't think they ever start as faults. But, memory is just such a mess. And I'll tell one more story on my husband. This poor guy, he's been so abused during this tour. A couple of months ago, we were having one of those incredibly vital arguments in a domestic life where we were arguing what was written on a sweatshirt that was left in a cab in Dublin. Really important stuff. And I said it said A, and he said it said B, and I said it said A, and he said it's B, and I said it had to be A because blah, 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 and he said it had to be B because blah, blah, blah. By the way, I'm not a person who really asserts for myself or brags. I hope not to be. I am putting myself forward for the Nobel Peace Prize because I have achieved this in my household. We don't argue based on memory. When the argument begins to descend into a conflict over, I remember it this way, I remember it that way, I say we might as well stop. It's useless. And so we stopped the argument. No, don't worry about it. It was lovely. And
music for your story too.
and then a couple weeks after that, he decided to organize some old photo albums. And there's a photograph of me wearing the sweatshirt, and I was right, which is nice. And he's like, okay, you're right, I get the point. I said, no, the point is not that I was right, although it's nice to acknowledge it. The point is how fervently we both believed we were right, and one of us had to be wrong. But you were so sure, and I want you to focus on that. It could have been me, and I admit it really could have been me. My memory is so imperfect, and I don't swear to it. I happen to be right in this situation, but I want you to think about what you felt when you thought you were right. How sincere and absolute you were in your judgment that you knew what was going on. And if you really listen to people argue sometimes over memory, I've listened to my husband and stepson do this, and it's hilarious because they don't add any primary documentation. They just get louder and louder and louder, and they're always coming at it from but I remember it this way. And I was like, well, we've established that. But one of you has to be wrong. Only one of you can be right in this situation. And obviously, my mother-in-law is 86. An unkind story. She actually thought of it as a very funny story. But the story that she told me just reminded me that as a younger person, I could be impatient and unkind. And I really dug down. I looked and I looked and I looked for any memory I had of that story. It's not in there. And I thought, sometimes the mind really knows what to forget. And we should embrace that as well. Thank you very much for coming out today. And